The silence that followed the deaths of Rob Reiner and his wife did not arrive gently. It felt like a curtain dropped too early, cutting off a story that the world believed it still understood. For decades, Rob Reiner had been a public figure whose life seemed unusually transparent. He spoke freely, laughed loudly, argued passionately, and lived his convictions in front of cameras and crowds. His marriage appeared solid, long-lasting, and quietly unremarkable in a city that rarely allows such things to exist without scandal. And yet, when both he and his wife were suddenly gone, the silence left behind felt heavy, unfinished, and unsettling. Into that silence stepped Tracy Reiner, their daughter, a woman who had spent most of her life deliberately avoiding the spotlight her parents carried so easily. Tracy did not rush to speak. She did not release statements filled with polished grief or public platitudes. For days, she said nothing at all. Those close to the family later revealed that she had asked for privacy, not just from the media, but from Hollywood itself. Friends described her as unreachable, not in anger, but in shock. When she finally broke her silence, it was not with anger, accusation, or even sorrow in the way people expected. Instead, she spoke with a kind of calm that felt more alarming than tears. Her words suggested that the story the public believed it knew was incomplete, and perhaps dangerously simplified. She began by acknowledging the love she had for her parents, but she was careful not to mythologize them. She described Rob Reiner not as a legend, not as a cultural architect, but as a complicated man who carried the weight of being admired by millions while feeling misunderstood by the people closest to him. She spoke of a household filled with conversation, debate, and affection, but also one where emotional exhaustion quietly accumulated. According to Tracy, the public version of her parents' marriage, the one often described as stable and enduring, was real, but it was not the whole truth. Stability, she suggested, can sometimes be a form of survival rather than happiness. What unsettled listeners most was not what she accused her parents of doing, but what she implied they had been hiding from themselves. Tracy spoke of long nights where her father seemed restless, unable to turn off the noise of politics, culture, and legacy. She recalled moments when her mother acted as an anchor, not because she was unbreakable, but because she felt she had no choice. Tracy never used the word sacrifice, but it hung in the air between her sentences. The kind of sacrifice that does not announce itself loudly, that does not demand recognition, and that often goes unnoticed until it is too late. When asked directly about the circumstances surrounding their deaths, Tracy refused to speculate. She did not challenge official explanations, nor did she endorse them. Instead, she focused on something else entirely. She spoke about emotional erosion, about how decades of public life can hollow out private spaces. She questioned whether anyone truly noticed how tired her parents had become, not physically, but existentially. It was a subtle shift in the conversation, away from the mechanics of death and toward the conditions that precede it. Her words sparked discomfort across Hollywood. Many had known Rob Reiner for years, some for decades. They remembered him as energetic, opinionated, and endlessly engaged. Tracy's portrayal did not contradict that image, but it added a shadow behind it. A sense that constant engagement can become a form of self-erasure, that always having something to say can mask an inability to rest. She suggested that the greatest misunderstanding about her parents was the belief that they were immune to the quiet pressures that afflict ordinary families simply because they were extraordinary people. What Tracy's statement ultimately did was shift the narrative away from tragedy as an isolated event and toward tragedy as a long process. She did not frame her parents as victims, nor did she absolve the systems that surrounded them. Instead, she positioned their lives as a cautionary story about endurance, about how longevity in marriage, career, and public influence can sometimes conceal unresolved strain. Her refusal to simplify their story frustrated some observers, but for others, it felt like the first honest moment in a conversation that had been too neatly packaged. As the media cycle moved on, Tracy retreated again, leaving behind questions she seemed uninterested in answering. But the impact of her words lingered. They suggested that the true legacy of Rob Reiner and his wife might not lie solely in films, speeches, or public ideals, but in the uncomfortable realization that even the most visible lives can suffer quietly. And that sometimes, the most meaningful testimony comes not from those who lived loudly, but from those who learned to speak only when silence became impossible. Hollywood's reaction to Tracy Reiner's words was immediate, though rarely public. What unsettled people was not that she spoke at all, but how little she seemed interested in defending the mythology surrounding her parents. In private conversations, longtime colleagues of Rob Reiner admitted they felt exposed by her calm honesty. Many had shared dinners, sets, and political causes with him, yet few had considered what decades of relentless visibility might have cost him at home. Tracy's account quietly challenged the unspoken agreement Hollywood often makes with itself, the agreement that success justifies endurance, and endurance must always be framed as strength. Several insiders described a sudden shift in tone among those who had once spoken confidently about Rob Reiner's life. Stories that were previously told as anecdotes of passion and commitment now sounded different when retold through Tracy's lens. His intensity, once admired, began to resemble restlessness. His devotion to public discourse, once praised, seemed less like purpose and more like compulsion. Tracy did not accuse her father of neglect, but her words implied that being emotionally present while constantly engaged with the world is a balance few people ever truly achieve. Friends of her mother were even quieter. Some acknowledged, off the record, that Tracy's description resonated painfully. They recalled moments when her mother appeared tired in ways that had nothing to do with age. She was described as gracious, supportive, and endlessly patient, qualities Hollywood tends to romanticize without asking what sustains them. Tracy's refusal to glorify those traits forced an uncomfortable question into the open: how often does patience become self-erasure, and how rarely does anyone notice until it becomes irreversible? As media outlets searched for controversy, they found none that Tracy was willing to provide. She declined interviews that promised explosive revelations. She corrected misinformation without embellishing it. When conspiracy theories began to circulate online, she neither endorsed nor publicly dismissed them. Instead, she returned again and again to the same theme, that focusing solely on how her parents died distracted from understanding how they lived. To Tracy, the fixation on endings missed the deeper truth, that long before death arrives, there are quieter forms of disappearance that go unacknowledged. Her restraint became its own kind of statement. In an industry conditioned to dramatize grief, Tracy's refusal to perform sorrow unsettled expectations. Some interpreted her calm as detachment, others as unresolved anger, but those closest to her insisted it was neither. They described a woman who had spent years observing how narratives are shaped, and who understood that once a story becomes spectacle, it stops being truthful. By speaking carefully, Tracy controlled the boundaries of what could be taken from her family's pain. What emerged from her words was not a scandal, but a re-evaluation. People began revisiting Rob Reiner's later years with new attention, noticing patterns that had once been dismissed as personality quirks. The relentless pace. The inability to step back. The sense that rest was always postponed, always deferred to some future moment that never quite arrived. Tracy never claimed these traits caused her parents' deaths, but she made it impossible to ignore how deeply they shaped their lives. In the weeks that followed, Tracy withdrew again, leaving behind a narrative that resisted closure. She offered no final verdict, no emotional release, no tidy moral lesson. Instead, she left the public with something far more unsettling, the realization that even lives built on clarity, conviction, and public success can quietly fracture under the weight of their own endurance. And that sometimes, the most revealing truth is not what is said loudly, but what is finally allowed to be acknowledged without drama, without defense, and without illusion. After Tracy Reiner stepped back from public view, the space she left behind began to speak for her. In Hollywood, silence is rarely neutral, and hers was interpreted in multiple ways depending on who was listening. Some saw it as exhaustion, others as grief, but among those who had worked closely with her father, it was understood as something more deliberate. Tracy had said what she needed to say, not to satisfy curiosity, but to disrupt complacency. By refusing to elaborate, she denied the industry its usual cycle of revelation, reaction, and redemption. The media, accustomed to escalation, struggled with this restraint. Without new quotes or dramatic developments, coverage shifted toward retrospection. Articles revisited Rob Reiner's career, not just his achievements, but the emotional tone of his later years. Patterns emerged that once felt insignificant. His increasing seriousness. His narrowing patience for compromise. His tendency to frame every conversation as urgent. None of this suggested a man in crisis, but it painted the portrait of someone who never allowed himself to slow down. Tracy's words had not created this image, they had simply made it visible. Privately, some within Rob Reiner's inner circle began to question their own roles. There were quiet acknowledgments that invitations to rest were rarely extended, and when they were, rarely insisted upon. In Hollywood, admiration often replaces care. Praise becomes a substitute for concern. Tracy's statement forced an uncomfortable recognition that her parents were admired continuously, yet perhaps supported selectively. The system around them functioned efficiently, but emotionally, it relied on endurance rather than protection. What remained unresolved was whether Tracy believed things could have been different. She never addressed that question directly. Those close to her suggested that she did not dwell on hypothetical alternatives. Her focus appeared fixed on recognition rather than correction. She wanted the truth of her parents' lives to be understood without distortion, without sentimentality, and without the false comfort of simple explanations. By refusing to assign blame, she made it harder for the public to absolve itself. As speculation gradually faded, Tracy's voice lingered in subtler ways. It influenced how colleagues spoke about legacy, about the cost of permanence, about the emotional contracts demanded by long careers. Her parents' deaths became less of a headline and more of a reference point. Not a scandal, but a caution. Not a mystery to be solved, but a condition to be acknowledged. Tracy had shifted the conversation from endings to accumulation, from sudden loss to gradual depletion. In this reframed narrative, Rob Reiner was no longer just the man behind beloved films or political convictions. He became an example of how sustained visibility can blur the line between purpose and pressure. His wife, once described primarily as a stabilizing presence, emerged as a figure whose strength may have masked her own fatigue. Tracy did not diminish them by speaking honestly. She restored their humanity by allowing them to be seen as finite. The absence of a final statement from Tracy felt intentional. She did not seek to define her parents' legacy alone, nor did she invite the public to complete it for her. Instead, she left it open, unresolved, reflective. In doing so, she resisted the Hollywood instinct to resolve discomfort quickly. Her silence suggested that some stories should remain unsettled, not because they are incomplete, but because closure can sometimes erase complexity. Ultimately, Tracy Reiner's decision to speak, and then to stop, may become the most enduring chapter in the story surrounding her parents' deaths. Not because it revealed hidden truths, but because it refused to simplify them. In an industry built on narrative control, she offered something far rarer, a pause. A moment where admiration, grief, and accountability were forced to coexist without resolution. And in that pause, the public was left to confront a reality it rarely acknowledges, that even the most visible lives can quietly run out of space to breathe. As time passed, Rob Reiner's public legacy began to shift in subtle but unmistakable ways. Not through official reassessments or formal tributes, but through the language people used when speaking about him. The certainty that once defined his image softened. Praise remained, but it was tempered by reflection. His films were still celebrated, his voice still recognized, yet there was a new hesitation, an awareness that greatness often arrives carrying costs that are easier to admire than to confront. Tracy Reiner's words had not dismantled her father's reputation, but they had altered its emotional texture. Industry veterans began framing Rob Reiner less as a tireless force and more as a man shaped by obligation. The question quietly circulating was no longer what he achieved, but whether he ever allowed himself permission to step away. Tracy had never suggested that he should have chosen differently, yet her reflections invited an unsettling thought. In Hollywood, stepping back is often treated as retreat rather than preservation. Her parents' lives exposed how deeply that belief is ingrained, and how dangerous it can become when endurance is mistaken for fulfillment. Tracy herself remained largely absent from public discussion. She attended no high-profile events, gave no follow-up interviews, and offered no clarifications. Friends described her as focused inward, protecting a private grief that did not require witnesses. This withdrawal was not read as avoidance, but as boundary setting. In choosing not to engage further, Tracy demonstrated an understanding that stories, once released, can consume those who continue to feed them. By stepping away, she ensured that her parents' narrative would not spiral into endless reinterpretation. The public, however, continued to search for meaning. Some critics attempted to frame Tracy's statement as a critique of Hollywood culture itself, while others resisted that interpretation, preferring to isolate the story as a singular family tragedy. Tracy never corrected either perspective. Her silence allowed multiple truths to coexist. It was possible for her parents' deaths to be deeply personal while also symbolically revealing something larger about the environment in which they lived. The lack of a definitive framing unsettled commentators accustomed to moral conclusions. What endured most strongly was the reframing of visibility as vulnerability. Rob Reiner had been outspoken, present, and engaged until the end, qualities often equated with vitality. Tracy's reflections suggested that constant presence can sometimes conceal an inability to disengage. Her mother's role, often described in terms of support and steadiness, gained new dimension when viewed through this lens. Stability, Tracy implied, is not always evidence of ease. Sometimes it is evidence of resilience stretched thin. Over time, Tracy's restraint came to be seen as an act of protection rather than withholding. She protected her parents from being reduced to symbols. She protected herself from becoming a spokesperson for grief. And perhaps most importantly, she protected the truth from being flattened into spectacle. By refusing to continue speaking, she preserved the complexity she had introduced. In doing so, she resisted the industry's demand for resolution. The long-term impact of Tracy's brief intervention may lie precisely in its incompleteness. There was no final lesson, no redemptive arc, no dramatic reversal. Instead, there was recognition. Recognition that long lives can end quietly even when lived loudly. Recognition that love can coexist with exhaustion. Recognition that legacies, when examined closely, reveal both light and erosion. As Rob Reiner's work continues to be revisited by new generations, Tracy's words will likely remain in the background, not as an accusation, but as context. They invite viewers to see not just the product of a life, but the conditions under which it was sustained. And perhaps that is the most enduring contribution she could make. Not to redefine her parents' achievements, but to remind the world that behind every celebrated narrative lies a human cost that rarely announces itself, and that sometimes, acknowledging that cost is the only honest form of remembrance. In the months that followed, the stories surrounding Rob Reiner and his wife settled into a strange stillness. There were no new revelations, no official corrections, no dramatic turns to revive public attention. And yet, the absence of noise did not diminish the weight of what Tracy Reiner had said. If anything, it allowed her words to deepen. Without repetition, without reinterpretation, they remained intact, resisting dilution. In Hollywood, where meaning is often reshaped through constant retelling, this permanence felt unusual and unsettling. What lingered most powerfully was the unresolved nature of the story. Tracy had offered no final explanation for her parents' deaths, nor had she suggested that one should exist. The unanswered questions became part of the legacy themselves. Rather than demanding solutions, they invited reflection. How does a life spent under continuous scrutiny alter one's relationship with rest? How does a marriage survive public endurance while quietly absorbing private fatigue? How often does devotion become indistinguishable from obligation? These were not questions Tracy posed directly, but they hovered persistently in the space she left behind. Some observers began to describe her statement as an act of moral restraint. In refusing to dramatize grief, she avoided turning her parents into symbols for causes they could no longer consent to represent. In refusing to accuse, she denied the public an easy villain. And in refusing to continue speaking, she preserved the emotional truth of what she had already shared. Tracy seemed to understand that grief, when over-explained, loses its integrity. Silence, in this context, was not absence, but fidelity. Rob Reiner's legacy, viewed through this lens, became quieter but more human. His achievements remained undeniable, but they were no longer isolated from the conditions that produced them. His intensity, once celebrated without question, was now understood as something that required maintenance and perhaps exacted a toll. His wife's steadiness, once praised as effortless grace, was reinterpreted as strength sustained over time rather than natural ease. Tracy had not rewritten their story. She had slowed it down enough for its contours to become visible. In private, those closest to the family suggested that Tracy never intended to shape public discourse at all. Her decision to speak was described as necessary rather than strategic. She did not seek to influence how her parents would be remembered. She sought to prevent them from being misunderstood. That distinction mattered. It explained her precision, her restraint, and her refusal to expand. Once the misunderstanding had been addressed, she stepped away, trusting the truth to stand without reinforcement. As public attention gradually moved elsewhere, Tracy's silence took on a final meaning. It marked an end point not to grief, but to explanation. In a culture that demands narrative closure, she left the story deliberately unfinished. This refusal forced audiences to sit with discomfort rather than consume resolution. It suggested that some losses are not meant to be processed quickly, and some lives cannot be summarized without distortion. Ultimately, the power of Tracy Reiner's voice lay not in what it revealed, but in what it declined to resolve. She reminded the world that legacy is not only built from achievements, but from the unseen labor of endurance. That love does not eliminate exhaustion. That public success does not protect against private depletion. And that sometimes, the most honest way to honor the dead is not to explain them away, but to allow their complexity to remain intact. When the story of Rob Reiner and his wife is revisited in the future, it will likely be Tracy's restraint that endures. Not as a footnote, not as controversy, but as a pause. A moment where spectacle gave way to recognition. And in that pause, something rare occurred. The world was asked not to judge, not to solve, but simply to acknowledge. With time, the absence of spectacle surrounding Rob Reiner and his wife became its own quiet statement. In an industry trained to convert every loss into narrative capital, the refusal of this story to evolve into something louder began to feel intentional, almost corrective. Tracy Reiner never returned to clarify her words, never stepped in to guide interpretation, and never attempted to shape how history would remember her parents. Instead, she allowed memory to do what it rarely does in public life, settle naturally, without constant intervention. This restraint gradually reframed how grief itself was understood. Tracy's approach suggested that mourning does not always require articulation. That explanation, when repeated too often, can erode the truth it seeks to preserve. Her silence stood in contrast to a culture that equates visibility with authenticity. By withdrawing, she demonstrated that meaning can exist without narration, and that dignity sometimes depends on what remains unsaid. In retrospect, Tracy's brief decision to speak now appears less like a revelation and more like a boundary. She drew a line between acknowledgement and exposure, between honesty and exploitation. Everything beyond that line was left untouched. This distinction mattered. It protected her parents from becoming symbols detached from their lived reality. It protected herself from becoming the permanent interpreter of their pain. And it protected the story from being consumed by the very mechanisms that often strip tragedy of its depth. Rob Reiner's legacy, viewed through this quieter lens, becomes less about certainty and more about contradiction. A man celebrated for clarity of voice, yet burdened by the cost of constant engagement. A life defined by creative authority, yet shaped by pressures rarely acknowledged in public success stories. His wife's presence, once summarized in simple terms of support and stability, now carries the weight of endurance that often goes unseen. Tracy's intervention did not diminish either of them. It returned scale to their humanity. What makes this story endure is not mystery, but recognition. Recognition that even long, outwardly successful lives can reach a point of depletion without visible warning. Recognition that love can coexist with fatigue without negating itself. Recognition that endurance, when unexamined, can quietly become expectation rather than choice. Tracy never accused the world of failing her parents. She simply revealed how easy it is to misunderstand what strength looks like when it is sustained for too long. As the years pass, this narrative will likely be revisited not for answers, but for perspective. It offers no closure in the conventional sense, no emotional crescendo, no final confession. Instead, it leaves behind an invitation to reflect. To reconsider how public admiration intersects with private cost. To question whether silence always signifies absence, or whether it can sometimes represent completion. In the end, Tracy Reiner's role in this story may be remembered as profoundly minimal, yet deeply consequential. She spoke once, with care, and then stepped back. That decision preserved the integrity of her parents' lives far more effectively than continued explanation ever could. It allowed their story to remain complex, unresolved, and human. And perhaps that is the final truth this story offers. That not every legacy needs to be clarified. Not every grief needs to be narrated. And not every silence is empty. Some silences, when chosen deliberately, become the most honest form of remembrance. As the public distance from the events increased, what remained was not confusion but a quieter awareness. The deaths of Rob Reiner and his wife no longer occupied headlines, yet their story lingered in conversations that had nothing to do with them directly. It surfaced whenever discussions turned to longevity, to marriages that appeared unbreakable, to careers sustained by relentless presence. Tracy Reiner's words had subtly altered the way people listened to those stories. There was now an instinct to look past the surface, to consider what endurance might be costing beneath the appearance of stability. What made this shift significant was that it occurred without instruction. Tracy never asked the public to rethink Hollywood, nor did she frame her parents' lives as warnings. She simply described what she had witnessed, and then allowed others to recognize themselves in it. That restraint gave her account credibility. It did not demand belief. It invited recognition. And recognition, once offered, proved difficult to withdraw. In this sense, Tracy's role became almost archival rather than expressive. She preserved a moment of truth without reshaping it to fit expectation. Her refusal to continue speaking prevented the narrative from hardening into interpretation. Without repetition, her words remained closer to experience than commentary. This distinction matters because experience, unlike commentary, resists simplification. It carries ambiguity without apology. For Rob Reiner, this meant that his public image was no longer confined to achievement alone. It expanded to include the conditions under which that achievement was sustained. The urgency, the constant engagement, the refusal to disengage even when disengagement might have been necessary. These traits were not recast as failures. They were understood as human limitations shaped by environment and expectation. Tracy did not strip her father of dignity. She restored proportion to his life. Her mother's presence, too, gained new resonance. The idea of steadiness, so often praised without scrutiny, was now understood as an ongoing act rather than a natural state. Strength became something practiced daily, not something possessed effortlessly. This reframing did not romanticize sacrifice. It acknowledged its reality. Tracy never suggested that her mother's endurance was tragic. She suggested only that it was costly. What endures most powerfully from this story is the refusal of spectacle. In a cultural landscape that thrives on excess explanation, Tracy Reiner offered something almost radical, a limit. She demonstrated that truth does not require amplification to remain true. That grief does not need performance to be valid. And that silence, when chosen deliberately, can be an act of respect rather than withdrawal. Over time, this approach has influenced how similar stories are received. There is greater hesitation before assigning meaning too quickly. Greater caution before framing private lives as symbols. Tracy's decision to step back created a model rarely seen in public mourning. It showed that closure is not always an endpoint delivered by narrative, but sometimes a boundary set by restraint. In the end, the story of Rob Reiner and his wife remains unresolved by design. It does not conclude with certainty, judgment, or lesson. It concludes with awareness. Awareness that visibility does not guarantee understanding. That success does not insulate against depletion. And that the most honest tribute may not be found in celebration or explanation, but in allowing complexity to stand uncorrected. Tracy Reiner did not offer the world answers. She offered it a pause. And in that pause, something essential was restored. The recognition that behind every public life lies a private reality that deserves to remain intact, even when the world demands more.